This week on Myth, it's a whole new world of assholes as we dive into the creation myths of the ancient Greeks. I'll tell you the heartwarming tale of how the universe was first created, including stories of children being eaten alive, children being shoved back inside their mothers, and children cutting their father's dicks off, because the ancient Greeks believed you couldn't make an omelet without mutilating a few family members. This is the Myths Your Teacher Hated podcast, where I tell the stories of cultures around the world in all of their original, bloody, uncensored glory. Modern tellings of these stories have become dry and dusty, but I'll be trying to breathe new life into them. This is episode 1A, Gods Make Shitty Dads. As always, this episode is not safe for work. In the beginning, there was only chaos, which is honestly as it fucking should be. For the first few generations of gods in the ancient Greek myths, there's no real clear distinction drawn between places and concepts and the gods that embody them. They're sort of alive, they're sort of not, they kind of want things, but they also just kind of exist. It's a little confusing, but bear with me, they get a lot more personified as they get closer to the gods the Greeks thought existed at that time. That being said, Chaos, who's sort of just chaotic nothingness and sort of an entity, has two children, Night and Erebus. It's not really explained how. Erebus is the place where death lives, but not death. Again, sort of a place, sort of a creature, really confusing, fuck it, moving on. Night lays an egg inside Erebus, from which hatches Love. Not the goddess of love Aphrodite, who comes later and sort of takes over the post, again, kinda weird early on. Love then creates light and day, because of course it does. So now that the universe is starting to come into shape, Gaia, Mother Earth, comes into being, as does Uranos, Father Heaven. Again, not explained where they come from, it's just sort of logical that once love exists and night and day exists, of course Earth and sky are going to exist, and they just appear. At this point, the characters are going to start to be a lot more personified. The first personish creatures are monsters, born of Gaia and Uranos. The three were monstrously huge, with 100 hands and 50 eyes, called, and bear with me, this is a weird fucking name, Hekatanakares, which means the 100-handed ones. Since I'm absolutely certain that I am butchering that name, I'll just call them the 100-handed ones from now on. Their names were Briareus or Aegeon, the Vigorous or the Sea Goat, Cottus, the Striker or the Furious, and Gyges, the Big-Limbed. It's possible that something is getting lost in translation here. The big-limbed one seems like the least impressive name for the three brothers, but if it's simply a descriptor of maybe his dick, then it becomes the most impressive name of the three brothers, and I'll choose to read it that way. You can form your own opinions. I'm sure I'm butchering those pronunciations, so if someone has some insight onto the proper way to pronounce them, I'd appreciate the feedback. The next three children were called the Cyclops, which means wheel-eye, and people are probably pretty fucking familiar with them. But if you don't already know, they had one huge eye in the middle of their forehead, which gave them terrible depth perception. This will prove important during the events of the Odyssey, where the protagonist, Odysseus, will come up against a different Cyclops. I'll be covering that story in another episode. They were also gigantic, being described as the size of small mountains, for some reason. Their names were Arges, which means thunderbolt, Steropes, which means lightning, and Brontes, which means thunder. So these guys are clearly storm gods. They were also, for some reason that's not really explained, smiths. Last were the Titans, and if you've ever seen the animated Disney movie Hercules, you'll see a perfect example of the kind of whitewashing I'm talking about. The movie makes Hera out to be a loving mother who somehow lost her child, instead of the murderous she-beast that tries to murder a child in its crib because her husband cheated on her. It also completely glosses over all of the blood and guts and gore and family murder that the story is absolutely full of. But it does give a fairly accurate representation of the size of the Titans, who make an appearance at the end as the villains. So if you want to see how big the Titans were compared to the Olympians, who were more or less human-sized sometimes, this is not a terrible way to get that. Although personally, I would recommend just playing Kingdom Hearts, where you can actually fight one of the Titans and get a real first-hand perspective on just how fucked you'd be going up against one of these monstrosities. For some reason, there are a lot more than 3 of this third group of gods, because the ancient Greeks said, fuck the rule of 3s. And unlike their earlier brothers, they weren't all forces of wanton destruction. I mean, most still were. But a few proved to be not only not destructive, but actually beneficial, first to the other Titans, and later to the human race. We'll see this in next week's episode. This takes place during the early days of the planet, when tsunamis and earthquakes and volcanoes and shit were frequent occurrences. So the idea of giant rampaging monsters roaming around and just tearing everything the fuck up is honestly a pretty good metaphor for that kind of chaos if you really think about it. Uranus begins what will become a long-standing trend of gods being shitty dads, and decides he really hates his kids, especially the hundred-handed ones. Granted, they're rampaging forces of absolute destruction, but still, take care of your damn kids. Those three he imprisons deep inside the earth in a secret place. Remember, in this scenario, the earth is a woman, so he's shoving the children back inside of her womb, which, despite being inside of her vagina, she can't find and doesn't know where they are. This pisses her off, as one would expect, and she builds a sickle made out of flint and asks her kids for help. Most rightly tell her to fuck off, because they're having fun destroying shit, and besides, it wasn't like Uranus came for them. Fuck their brothers, they were weird looking anyway. The youngest Titan, Cronus, agrees to help, because he's a mama's boy. She's mad as hell, so she doesn't want to just hurt him. In what will also be a long-standing trend, she gets back at him in a thoroughly ancient Greek way. If you don't know already, you'll find out more when I talk about the Greek mythological underworld in a future episode. But the ancient Greeks loved their punishment to fit the crime, in as literal a sense as they could. Since he had hurt her kids, she'd go full on Lorena Bobbitt on his ass, and make sure he couldn't have any more kids. And in case it's not clear, when I say full on Lorena Bobbitt, I mean use the flint sickle she'd been building to have his dick cut off. But she didn't want to do the deed herself, because that would be way too normal for a Greek myth. Instead, she's asking her kids to do it, because apparently psychological abuse doesn't count as torture in her book. Cronus, being said mama's boy, agrees and waits in the darkness for his father. He jumps out and cuts off his dick and leaves him there to bleed, to really think about what a shitty dad he had to be if one of his children was willing to literally emasculate him, and Oedipus hadn't even been born yet. He either dies, withdraws into the earth, or goes to Italy. Seriously, those are all real versions of the story. His dick blood somehow manages to create more children from the dust of the earth. She's really fertile, guys. His semen, somehow already in his dick when he dies, not sure what got him horny about his kid trying to kill him, but different strokes, I guess, spills across the sky, which is also him, because he is a sky god, and creates the Milky Way. In another version of the story, Cronus throws Orianus' dick into the ocean, and the semen, which is still somehow inside of his dick when he dies, spills into the sea, gets it pregnant, and gives birth to Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Kinda have to wonder if they get all of that because the ocean is salty and smells like fish. Have fun trying not to think about that one the next time you go to the beach. The giants and the Erinyes, better known as the Furies, are born from this blood. The latter seek out and punish the wicked, because maybe being born from that kind of punishment made them really inclined to keep it up. The Furies were horrifyingly ugly, with snakes for hair and eyes that wept blood. Imagine that coming for you in a dark alley. The story says that as long as there is sin in the world, they will remain, so they're still alive and kicking. In spite of having literally killed a god for imprisoning his brothers, Cronus takes power and immediately imprisons the hundred-handed ones in Tartarus, the hell part of the underworld. Again, more on the underworld later. For good measure, he throws the Cyclopes in too, because to the ancient Greeks, being a god meant being a short-sighted asshole. Cronus marries his sister Rhea, another thing you'll see a lot of in myths and in history, and together they rule the pretty much empty universe, which is still pretty much just his monster brothers and his dad's dickless corpse. He hears a prophecy that one of his kids is going to do to him what he did to his dad, and to try to thwart fate, and believe me, fate hates that, he decides to follow in dear old dad's footsteps and be a really shitty dad. Like I said, it's gonna show up a few times. He turns the shittiness up to a new level and has all of his children brought to him as soon as they're born, still in swaddling clothes, and swallows them whole. 'Cause nothing says family bonding like a little cannibalism. This goes pretty much the way you'd expect. Rhea does what he wants, 'cause he did kill his goddad, so he's pretty scary. But she gets more and more resentful as time goes on, kinda like Gaia did. The ancient Greeks loved that symmetry shit in their stories, and she plots against her husband brother. But not before letting him eat 5 babies. 5. When the 6th, Zeus, was born, she had him secretly carried off to Crete to be raised by nymphs, and it makes you wonder why she didn't do that in the first place if she could have. On the other hand, given that her husband was a child-eating monstrosity, and that he had slaughtered his own father, maybe she had reason to not try to piss him off right up front by defying him and trying to keep her children away from him. It's certainly possible that it took her a little while to try to figure out who she could trust to help her out, where she could take the children, and how she would pass all this off. So perhaps it's completely understandable that it took her 5 children to finally figure out a reasonable plan. As we'll see later, she does work to try to retrieve the rest of her children, or at least avenge them. Being raised by nymphs might explain why Zeus is such a philandering asshole. Nymphs are known for being the free-love hippies of the ancient world, but probably not. Probably, he's just an asshole who liked power too much. She gives Cronus a rock, wrapped in swaddling clothes, which he swallows whole as well. Luckily, he isn't a very good cannibal, and he can't tell the difference between a baby and a rock, so he totally buys it. The kid grows up and ends up hitting it off with Metis, one of the Titans, whom Rhea had trusted to help take care of him. She helps Rhea trick him, and convinces him that he's a young Titan, so Cronus agrees to make Zeus his new cupbearer. He's paranoid enough to eat babies because they might grow up and kill him, but his bitter wife brings him a kid that looks a lot like him to be a trusted servant, and he's totally down with it, no questions asked. Zeus marries Metis, and she helps him betray the God King. The sex must be mind-blowing. Metis makes a potion to make someone vomit, and Zeus slips it into Cronus' wine. He pukes, like, a lot. Like, think those gross-out comedies from the 90s, it's like that. Only with children. Because all 5 kids that he ate come out, now fully grown to adulthood. These would come to be known as the Olympians, Zeus's brothers and sisters. They were Hestia, Hades, Hera, Poseidon, and Demeter. Granted, they're immortal, so I get the being alive thing, but what the fuck did they eat for the last 20 years? Or however long it takes for gods to reach adulthood? I mean, honestly, if you think about it, there's really only one option, and it's pretty disgusting. Anyway, Cronus realizes he's been tricked and goes to war, which carries the bitching name of the Titanomachy. The children, who would come to be known as the Olympians, organize and decide to make Zeus their leader, since he did save them all from sitting in digested food and stomach acid for all eternity. 3 of the Titans, Prometheus, Epimetheus, and Oceanus, decide to betray their brothers and join the Olympians. Prometheus, whose name means forethought, is considered to be extremely wise, possibly the wisest being in existence, so he sees that Cronus is a slightly bigger dick than Zeus, and sees a way that the Olympians can win. As you'll see in the next episode, this does not turn out well for Prometheus. The rest of the Titans stick with their brother because fuck it. It was only their half-brothers that he locked up after cutting off their dad's dick because someone locked them up. Cronus made Atlas the Titan general, and he proceeded to whip Olympian ass. Which is not too hard, because let's be honest, there are a lot more Titans than there are Olympians, even with the 3 defectors. Prometheus counsels Zeus to free the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones, what with them being incredibly destructive monsters with a serious hate boner for the Titans. The Cyclopes, being storm gods and smiths, make thunderbolts for Zeus to use in battle. He uses them to lure the Titans after him, where they are ambushed by the 100-handed ones, who rain boulders down on them from hiding. The battle nearly destroys the planet, and the Titans thought the very mountains were being pulled down on their heads. To be fair, they kind of were. They surrender, and Zeus, being a magnanimous and gracious leader, lets them be. Just fucking with you, he throws them into Tartarus and makes the 100-handed ones the jailers, because again with the symmetry thing. Atlas, for being the general, he banished to a distant location and forces him to bear the pillar of the sky on his shoulders forever. It's not really clear why he decided to punish Atlas with way more specificity and intent, since Cronus is simply thrown into Tartarus with the rest of the Titans, but maybe he decided to blame someone other than his dick-destroying dad, just in case he ever got out of Tartarus and wanted his revenge. In some versions of the story, Zeus even decides to put Cronus in charge of the underworld version of heaven known as the Elysian Fields, So maybe he was misplacing his anger at his dad onto Atlas since he has some semblance of familial ties. Zeus has, like his father before him, forgotten that imprisoning children was how this whole fucking thing started. Gaia already started one war that nearly destroyed the entire universe to free her children, so Zeus is being monumentally short-sighted here, which is nothing new for the Olympian. In her rage that her children are being imprisoned yet again, she conceives and gives birth to her last child, the monster known as Typhon. It's not clear who the father is, but hate seems the most likely candidate at this point. Typhon is known as the father of all monsters, and was a fire-breathing dragon with 100 unsleeping heads. He marries Echidna, the mother of all monsters, one of the Titans, and they have a bunch of monster kids, the most famous of which being the Sphinx, the Nemean lion, and Cerberus, all of whom will pop up again in later stories. Typhon decides to go and fight Zeus because Gaia, mother of all, is apparently really good at guilting her children into going off and trying to kill relatives for her. Zeus decides to stay and fight. Typhon was, after all, trying to murder him, but the rest of the gods make excuses about other appointments they forgot about, so sorry, and they run off to clean the piss stains off of their robes. Zeus, figuring that there's no such thing as a fair fight with a giant rage monster, stays atop Mount Olympus and flings his magical lightning bolts at Typhon. This is apparently enough to kill even a 100-headed hate monster, and it's buried beneath Mount Etna. Of course, the universe being what it was, the giants, remember them springing up from dick blood? They rebelled. They piled up entire mountains to try and reach the top of Mount Olympus. Unlike when Typhon attacked, this time the other Olympians stay beside Zeus on top of Mount Olympus and they fight. This doesn't end well for the giants, and they are quickly exterminated down to the last man. With the universe now firmly under their rule, it was time to divvy up everything and decide who got to be god of what. I know, it seems kind of odd that someone can just kind of decide to be the god of the sea or the god of the storm. It seems like that's a thing you should be born into and have inherent abilities. But at least with this group of gods, this was apparently the case. Zeus and his two brothers, Poseidon and Hades, draw lots to see who will be god of what. Zeus gets the heavens and the storms, Poseidon gets the sea, and Hades gets the shaft. He's chosen as the god of the underworld, which understandably upsets him. He says to his brothers, "Seriously guys, what the fuck? You get to be the gods of cool shit, and I have to be the thing that everyone fears most? People will build temples to the storm god, asking for the rains to come and the storms to stay away. People will build temples to the sea god, asking for good fishing and for safe passage to their next port. No one but a few lunatics will build temples to the death god. Seriously, everyone's gonna hate me, and it's all your fault." His brothers, happy with the way things turned out for them, tell him to suck it up, Buttercup. This whole experience leaves him morose, dour, depressed, and a little rapey. Admittedly, many of the gods are a little rapey, but most don't kidnap their future wives and force them to live in sexual slavery. I'll get into more details about the kidnapping of Persephone in a later episode. We're going to leave the main story there for this week, which means it's time for Gods and Monsters. This is a segment where I get into a little more detail about the personalities and history of one of the gods and monsters from this week's pantheon that wasn't discussed in the main story. This week's god is Morpheus. I'm guessing that for most of you, that name conjures up images of Lawrence Fishburne in a trench coat, but the Matrix hacker chose his name for a reason. Morpheus is the god of dreams, and one of the coolest but least known gods in the Greek pantheon. He has the ability to appear in the dreams of any mortal, and, being in control of the stuff of dreams, he could take any form he wanted. He's the main influence on Neil Gaiman's character in the Sandman comics, and that version of Dream is honestly a pretty great depiction of Morpheus. If you haven't read the graphic novels, go do so right fucking now. I'm serious, they're awesome. When Morpheus would enter your dreams, you would sleep well, but you would also see visions of your own future or important coming events. He would also bring messages from the other gods for important mortals, especially kings and heroes, that he would craft as dreams. In his natural form, he was a winged fucking demon, with 3 brothers. Phobator, who was the creator of nightmares and was fucking terrifying to behold. Phantasis, who created the fantastic, illusory dreams and had no corporeal form whatsoever. And Ikelos, who created realistic dreams. The 3 were collectively known as the Oniori, and I'm sure I didn't get that name right. It is said that King Sleep and his brothers were gifted their wings by their uncle Thanatos, the god of death, not to be confused with Hades, the god of the underworld. Morpheus would use his wings to reach those who needed help in their dreams, and on more than one occasion to carry his father Hypnos, the god of sleep and the source of the word hypnotism, to the dream world when he had pissed Zeus off enough to need fucking protection, which apparently happened quite a few times. Zeus is kind of a little pussy. His mother, Pasiphae, is the goddess of relaxation and rest, though other stories have his mother being Nyx, the goddess of the night. That's it for this episode of Myths Your Teacher Hated. Keep up with new episodes on our Facebook page, on iTunes, or on Stitcher. Or follow us on Twitter as @HardcoreMyth. If you like what you've heard, I'd appreciate a review on iTunes, since it helps increase the show's standing and lets more people know that it exists. For now, iTunes is the best place to leave a review. If you have any questions, any thoughts on stories, any feedback on pronunciations, or any ideas for future stories that you'd like to hear, feel free to drop me a line on Facebook or on Twitter. I'm trying to pull as much material from as many different cultures as possible, but there are still all sorts of stories that I've never heard, so suggestions are very much appreciated. The theme music is by Tiny Cheese Puff, whom you can find on Fiverr.com. Next week, we'll finish off the Greek creation myth with the story of the creation of man, the incredibly sexist story of the creation of woman, and multiple extinction-level hissy fits. After that, I'll be moving on from the Greeks for a while to hit some other cultures. That's all for now. Thanks for listening.